Welcome back to Awakening Reformation, where Reformation awakens now. My name is Grant, and joined with me tonight is my beautiful wife, Erica, the weaker vessel.
Hello, everyone.
If you would like to find out more about Awakening Reformation, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Our Twitter handle is at @AwakenReformPod. You can also email us, awakeningreformation@gmail.com. You can find us on iTunes and all other podcast catchers. You can subscribe and rate and review us on there. We would greatly appreciate it. And this week we want to shout out a new like on the Facebook page.
Yes, Leslie Eishen. I think that's how you say the last name.
Thank you, Leslie, for liking the Facebook page.
You're awesome. So, quick reminder, we are doing our giveaway this month for the month of July. If you guys would like some swag, some Awakening Reformation swag, we have some t-shirts, some stickers. We have a really big tumbler with our logo on it that is awesome and fits like half a pot of coffee in it. It's a 30-ounce tumbler. It's pretty awesome.
It's a coffee pot tumbler.
Basically.
Yeah.
So, if you guys want some free stuff, all you have to do to get put into a running to win some stuff is just give us a review on your iTunes or any podcast catcher. You can go to our Facebook page and leave us a review. Anything like that. Just leave us a review. You'll get put into the running for some pretty cool stuff.
And that runs for the month of July, right?
Yep. So at the end of July, we will be announcing our winners.
Sounds awesome.
We're kind of both a little starstruck right now. We just got to do an interview with Douglas Wilson.
That's right. You heard her.
Douglas Wilson.
We somehow got Pastor Doug Wilson to agree to come on Awakening Reformation podcast. So we were going to turn on that interview with him here in just a second. The topic that we discussed with him is what a Christian should think about war.
Christian's perspective on war.
Yep. So again, Doug Wilson is author and pastor of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho. He's written a lot of books that Eric and I love his preaching and his perspective. So we hope you enjoy it. Our interview with Pastor Doug Wilson. All right. Well, tonight we have Pastor Doug Wilson on Awakening Reformation podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, Doug.
Great to be with you.
Some of our listeners may not know who you are and what you do. So if you wanted to take a few minutes and introduce yourself and let the listeners know.
Sure. Here are some basic details. I just turned 65
Happy birthday.
A week or two ago. Yeah, thank you. And I live in the chimney of Idaho, in the panhandle that runs up toward Canada. So I live in the northern part of Idaho. I've been the pastor of Christ Church here for over 40 years. Before that, I was a philosophy student, and before that, I was in the submarine service of the United States Navy. So, happily married to Nancy Wilson, and we've had 3 kids. They all live here in Moscow. And between our 3 kids, we have 17 grandkids.
That's awesome.
So Erica and I have read quite a bit of your books as well as your wife's books.
Mm-hmm.
We enjoy listening to your sermons every week and the various YouTube videos that Canon Press as well as the podcast.
Yep.
We really enjoy your ministry. We've benefited greatly from it. And I think probably in the last year, our theology has changed a lot and has become more reformed. And just want to thank you for being very influential in that, and it's been such a blessing.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks for paying attention.
So, relative to the topic we want to talk about, I am a chaplain assistant in the Army.
Uh-huh.
We have gotten several questions from friends, from family throughout the last several years that I've been in the Army. A lot of them are asking us about a biblical basis or basically what a Christian should think about war. Is it a godly endeavor, or is it always against God's design for human flourishing? How would you answer that question?
Okay, so it's obviously, since wars are complicated subjects, addressing it from a Christian perspective is not going to be a simple 1, 2, 3, and then that will answer all your questions forever. Mm-hmm. But the historic Christian tradition, which I believe is rooted in Scripture, is the tradition that holds to what is called just war theory. So what that means is that wars, like every other human endeavor, can be lawful, can be unlawful. It depends on the circumstances, and it depends on how you conduct yourself. It depends on why are you going to war. Are you at war because the space aliens invaded? That's a simple. Oh, okay, that would be okay to fight in that circumstance. Are you at war with Canada because you were greedy for all their timber and fish and invaded, right? So if you're just conducting an international smash and grab run, then obviously the war would be unlawful. If you are simply defending yourself from marauders, it would be lawful. So then the question is, since you've got lawful forms of war and unlawful forms of war, you then have to figure out where the boundary is between the two.
Would you say, as a post-millennial kind of theonomist, does your eschatology influence any part of how you would determine what would be a just form of war or maybe a wicked form of war?
Yeah, I think it. I am post-mill and I am theonomic with a small t. And it would be, the theonomy affects the question of war more directly than the postmillennial aspect does, right, although both affect it. Theonomy is simply short for God's law, and since we believe that we are to be mindful of God's law in everything that we do, that would include when we go to war. I would think that it would include especially when you go to war. So if there's ever a time when I should be mindful of what God tells us to do and not do, it should be when I've got lethal weapons in my hands. I need to remember that God is God and that I am not God. And so understanding and being well versed in what the Bible teaches would be essential as you go to war. The eschatology would figure into this a little obliquely, but I think it does relate. The history of the human race is, by and large, a history of war. We've been fighting the whole time. And if you believe that God's kingdom is advancing and progressing throughout human history, you believe that that's happening despite all the fighting, and sometimes it's advancing because of the fighting.
Yeah, true. So with what you said about there being, a just way to do war and an unjust way, how will then a Christian or a non-Christian view war, and then what is that thing that makes them view it differently?
Okay, the first thing, if a Christian wants to think biblically about this as he ought to, that's the first thing that's going to set him apart. The non-believer, the non-believing soldier or sailor or airman, who doesn't have anybody senior to him other than his commanding officer, right? The Christian has to remember God, and the person who has no God is basically at the mercy of the general or the admiral. So the Christian goes into a warfare situation under the authority of someone, God, who's not in the chain of command. Yeah. Someone who's senior to the Pentagon, someone who's senior to the White House.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yep.
So that means that there are certain things for the believer that will be simply off the table. He's not going to do that. And this leads to a distinction that has to be made at the front end. Once you're talking to Christians, you have to distinguish between. I'm going to give you a couple of Latin phrases.
Go for it.
Jus, J-U-S, jus ad bellum, justice with regard to going to war, and jus in bello, justice in the conduct of war. So jus ad bellum has to do with what are the biblical criteria for those who are making the decision to go to war. Okay, if Congress is considering whether to declare war, or the decision makers have to deal with jus ad bellum. The average soldier or sailor has to make decisions about jus in bello. That has to do with your conduct in the course of war. So let's say you're just a private in the jungle fighting somewhere, and your commanding officer tells you to massacre the villagers. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You have to say no. You have to say no, because that would be an injustice in bello. And the lowliest foot soldier is in a position to make that determination. He was just told to murder some people, and he should say no. Okay? The average foot soldier is not in a position to get a PhD in geopolitics to figure out what on earth is going on in Yemen before he's ordered to go there. Okay? Mm-hmm. So the jus ad bellum criteria that Augustine famously developed. What are the questions you have to answer before you go to war? Is it a proportionate response? Is there an adequate hope of victory? Is the cause just? Things
Mm-hmm.
like that. Those are not questions that the at rank and file enlisted man has to answer.
So I've noticed on social media when American politicians and leaders strike somewhere in the world, usually there's some sort of uproar, and it's always the people acting like they have that PhD in geopolitics. Do you have any comments on that, and how we can kind of either use the Word of God to handle those kinds of situations as we see the news?
Yeah. Basically, the internet has not made us wiser. The internet just enables us to move our ignorance around the world at high rates of speed. We should be a lot more cynical about what we see people pronouncing on. President so-and-so did this because of oil. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know that.
Yeah.
How could you possibly know that? Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's like, for the last 20 or 30 years, I've been watching the left say about Middle East conflict, no blood for oil, no blood for oil, no blood for oil, because they've said that everything in the Middle East, we're there because we want their oil. And so if someone says, okay, let's come back, let's check out of the Middle East and let's drill for oil here, let's go up to Alaska and drill, baby, drill. Then all of a sudden, the left is yelling and hollering about that. Mm-hmm. Well, wait a minute. If you think that it's been a lust for oil that's been driving us to conquer the Middle East, then wouldn't it be wonderful if we went up and got our oil from Alaska? Well, apparently not. So basically, I think that many people handle international geopolitics very simplistically, and they are very dogmatic at the breakfast table or very dogmatic on Facebook. And I just think we need to read a book.
The few years I've been in the Army here and just sitting in certain meetings and being in the room, the more I know, the more I realize I don't know. And how much more there is to know about everything the military does. And maybe from your submarine time, you would resonate with that. Oh,
yeah, that's absolutely correct. So I'm locked up in a metal tube 400 feet down. And I'm doing math problems in the dark. I was in the navigation department when we were at battle stations. Okay. There is no conceivable way for me to understand the geopolitical justice or injustice of what our mission was. And fortunately, that's not my circus, not my monkeys, mm-hmm. right? I don't need to know that. I do need to know that if I'm taken, if we wound up taking a prisoner and I was told to torture him to get information out of him, I know that that's contrary to the Geneva Conventions. I know that that's contrary to the Universal Code of Military Justice. Mm-hmm. I know that I'm being commanded to do an unlawful thing. So I must disobey. And as C.S. Lewis said,